The parents of a 3-year-old boy who was hit and killed by an elderly driver with dementia have said a similar tragedy will happen again unless changes are made to licensing laws. 3-year-old Xander Irvine died in hospital after he was hit in Edinburgh in June 2020. A fatal accident inquiry found the self-certification system to be significantly defective, meaning the toddler's death could have been avoided and that the driver should not have been allowed behind the wheel. Speaking about their grief publicly for the first time, Xander's parents, Paul and Victoria, are urging the DVLA and the UK Government to follow a sheriff's recommendations to implement cognitive testing for drivers over 80. They sat down exclusively with STV's political reporter, Laura Alderman.
He was such a bright wee character, always full of fun. He loved books and stories. My neighbour described him as a little ray of sunshine, and that's exactly how we think of him.
3-year-old Xander Irvine from Edinburgh was a sociable little boy who loved nature and was cherished by his friends and family.
He loved books and stories. We spent a lot of time together outdoors, exploring nature. He loved playing in the woods and visiting the family farm in Northern Ireland.
The house was always full of joy, laughter, singing, and we were always just having a carry on. And then just that one day, it was all ripped away from us. And then the start of this life.
On the 30th of June 2020, Xander and his mum were walking down Morningside Road in Edinburgh when they were hit by a 91-year-old driver with undiagnosed dementia. Xander was rushed to hospital but died shortly after from his injuries.
As parents, in the weeks and months that followed after Xander's death, how did you cope?
I don't know how we coped, to be honest. Neither of us wanted to be here without him. We have a lot of good people around us, good family, friends and neighbours, and I think that's the only way that we can keep going. And we've always just stuck together for our boy.
I just remember the silence. I sat at the window just staring out into space for, it must have been close to a couple of months, and the whole house was just silent, no TV, nothing. We were both in shock.
A fatal accident inquiry at Edinburgh Sheriff Court last year found Xander's death could have been avoided and the driver should never have been behind the wheel in the first place. Sheriff Principal Nigel Ross said the current licensing regime whereby drivers over 70 self-certify their fitness to drive is significantly defective. He recommended a complete overhaul of the system with compulsory cognitive assessments for applicants over 80. He also said more questions about the driver's history should be added to the application form. This would require changes to primary legislation, a matter for the UK Government.
We felt a certain amount of relief that all the experts were in agreement that we needed to bring in these proportionate changes now, and we need to modernise the way we assess older drivers.
What's been recommended is a cognitive test, and it's basically designed by experts to ask a few questions, do a few puzzles that can easily flag up some sort of cognitive decline. It's certainly not trying to take anybody's independence away from them or anything like that. It's what Xander deserves. When I was sitting through the fatal accident inquiry, I heard a lot of experts saying that cognitive decline is on the increase and people are living longer, so it's only inevitable that something like this might happen again. More than likely will.
The DVLA said it would consider the Sheriff's recommendations when its medical advisory panel next meets in the spring.
Were you satisfied with that response?
It's not good enough, and that's why we're now appealing to the government and the DVLA to step up and make this a priority and to make this happen now.
I don't think we'll ever come to terms with it, especially given the circumstances and knowing that had there been something in place, something a bit more robust in the current system, then we might still have our boy.
In the wake of Xander's death, there was a huge outpouring of support. His parents hope more people will now have serious conversations about driving fitness as we age.
It's definitely a good thing that we're having these conversations, but it's not enough for us, and that's why we are pushing for this change in the law. This didn't need to happen, and it doesn't need to happen again. And I think if we can all act quickly on this, we could stop this from happening again. I really believe that. You know, Xander in his very short life he just made everything wonderful. And he certainly made us, I think, better people as parents. And, you know, I think he could make the world a better place now if we can all take notice and make changes now.
In the 3 years, 2 months, 8 days that we had him, I was the proudest father ever. And if we can make a positive change, then it will be worth it in his name.
How do you as a family remember your boy?
Oh, we just think about him all the time.
Yeah.
And we talk about him often. I always love talking about him. We've got so many beautiful photos and videos, and crucially just so many happy memories of him. He was a very happy wee boy, a very special little boy.
The parents of Xander Irvine talking to Laura Alderman there. Well, to discuss the principles of cognitive testing for older drivers, we were joined by Henry Simmons, Chief Executive of Alzheimer's Scotland. Henry, Sheriff Nigel Ross said the current system is significantly defective. Do you agree that those over the age of 80 should undergo mandatory cognitive tests?
Yeah, John, can I first of all share our condolences and sympathies with the Irvine family? It's obviously a tragedy that needs to be really understood and lessons learned from. And I think what the Sheriff has put forward are very reasonable recommendations. I mean, we think actually they could in some ways, because it's across a broad spectrum, it's not specifically targeting any one group, it's about, you know, a general approach to everyone being screened at that age, that could actually be something that's positive.
He did suggest that maybe even taking it lower to 75. How would you feel about that? Again,
John, I think that the situation at present is when someone gets a diagnosis of dementia, the process that they go through is that they will inform the DVLA, they'll inform their insurance. So for someone who has a diagnosis, this would not really change. I think what it would do is it might help some people who maybe are in that very difficult stage before they've got a diagnosis, who need some help or assistance, and the opportunity for, I mean, what the Sheriff's recommendation is an initial cognitive test with a further assessment. It could in fact be something that's positive to help people who have got some underlying concerns that have not been identified.
Is the current self-assessment system, is that sometimes difficult for people to negotiate?
I think what's difficult, again, it's the stage where prior to having a diagnosis of dementia, families might be experiencing concerns, and individuals, they're faced with many challenges. You've got the stigma associated with dementia, you've got the issues of perhaps getting a diagnosis, you've got family concerns, people may be noticing issues such as driving abilities, and that period of time prior to diagnosis can be quite challenging. And in a sense, what this might do is if we did have a process where there is an assessment, I think that people would be willing to go through that, and if there are any risks identified, to go for a further assessment. It might be a helpful step forward, but it is a very difficult period for people, John, and many people reach the point of diagnosis, and it's been quite a traumatic journey, and we've got lots of problems with undiagnosed levels of dementia. We've got lots of problems just encouraging people to come forward for a timely diagnosis. So in some ways I think this is much more about people who don't yet have a diagnosis of dementia, people who are going through these changes and concerns, and in a sense I think it could, as I said earlier, be a helpful thing in some ways for people.
There's also an issue, I suppose, from the other side of driving, giving older people independence, and it's difficult to take that away from them.
I think, John, the whole issue here has to be one of reciprocity. So, you know, as it stands just now, the assessment processes are pretty thorough. You might be asked to go for an assessment if you've got a diagnosis of dementia. That's not a given that you'll stop driving, because I think to take that ability for someone away, I mean, just now it's very difficult for people to access post offices, banks, shopping. You know, you really are making a huge decision in someone's lives. If that is as a consequence a risk, then it's fair enough. But I do think that we've got to consider that what we might find ourselves doing is that people are actually more isolated. You know, actually things could get worse. If you're starting to develop some form of cognitive difficulties that may lead to dementia, one of the big risk factors is isolation. And not everyone's got a family, not every community's got access to community transport. So we have to, I think very carefully about how, if this becomes a bigger feature, that how we actually react to that within our local communities and don't leave people isolated, John.
But overall, broadly, you accept the general recommendations of what the Sheriff was saying? I
think broadly, as it stands just now, the processes for assessment for people with dementia are quite clear. This would be a new approach that would give a sort of like a very consistent approach to a small cognitive assessment that would lead to further assessment. I don't think there's any harm in that, because what it might do is help some people who are going through the process get some extra help and support, John.
Henry, thanks for joining us in Scotland.
It's a pleasure, thank you, John.